This occurred a few weeks ago, so it's still vivid in my memory. I live in a quiet suburb of Delaware, but I'm a sophomore studying in California. This took place during fall break in October, while I was back home for a few days. I try to visit whenever I get the chance, though coming home always feels a bit bittersweet. I enjoy spending time with my parents, but they're extremely old-fashioned, which can feel stifling. One of the things that frustrates me is how strict they are about cannabis. Even though it's recently been legalized here, they'd lose it if they ever found out I used it. They struggle to accept that I'm an adult now, but at the end of the day, I respect them and wouldn't go against their rules, especially while living under their roof. Whenever I'm home, I have to be stealthy to avoid getting caught. Sneaking around my parents is something I've unfortunately become quite good at over the years. I can't even count the number of times I slipped out late at night or got into some kind of mischief as a kid. My dad has a ridiculously keen sense of smell, so smoking indoors is out of the question. Luckily, my childhood treehouse still stands in the front yard. My parents built it for me when I was little, and although it's a bit weathered and creaky now, it's held up remarkably well. It's high enough among the trees to be hidden from view, especially from the house. From up there, I can see the yard, the street, and some of the house's windows, but no one can spot me unless they know exactly where to look. As a kid, that treehouse was my go-to escape spot. If you knew what I was like growing up, you'd understand why I spent so much time there. Talking about it stirs up a lot of memories, but let me cut to the chase. On the Saturday before I was set to fly back to school, my parents were out attending some banquet or event that was supposed to last late into the evening. I wasn't sure exactly when they'd be back, but I knew I had hours to myself. Not wanting to risk being seen in the backyard, I decided to climb up into the treehouse with my stash, just to play it safe. It was chilly outside, and I could see my breath in the air. I have this theory that cold weather makes people more nostalgic, but maybe that's just me. Sitting up there felt peaceful, and it was nice having the place to myself. I've always loved being up high. It adds to the sense of tranquility. As the sun set, I thought about my life back at school. I was looking forward to returning. By the time I finished smoking, the sky had grown dark, and everything felt perfectly timed. That's when I noticed it. While scanning the yard, my eyes locked onto a light that had turned on inside the house. My heart froze. I was certain I was the only one home. A wave of fear gripped me, the kind that only hits when you're in real danger. My focus narrowed to that one illuminated window, like it was pulling me in. Suddenly, movement in the yard broke my trance. 3 hooded figures were moving quickly around the property, and my stomach sank as I realized what was happening. They made their way to the front steps, where a 4th person opened the door and let them in. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. My house was being burglarized. I didn't know what to do but couldn't tear my eyes away. Part of me was frozen in disbelief, and the other part was trying to process whether this was even real. At some point, my instincts took over. Without thinking, I found myself holding my phone, the keypad open. I dialed 911 and whispered to the operator about what was happening. Then I quickly hung up, afraid of making too much noise. As I put my phone away, the light from the screen must have caught the attention of one of the burglars outside. He whipped his head around, looking directly into the trees. My heart raced as I ducked down, hoping he hadn't seen me. But a moment later, I got my answer. I heard a sharp voice call out, "Hey!" Peeking through the gaps in the wooden floorboards, I saw a figure moving toward the tree's base. He knew I was there. My breath caught as he grabbed the wooden planks and began climbing toward me. Panicked, I shouted that the police were on their way, hoping to scare him off. But he didn't stop. His hands gripped the planks with determination, and it was clear he was intent on reaching me. Desperate, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, my bong, and hurled it at him. It smashed against his head, shattering into pieces. He let out a loud curse and fell to the ground. Though the fall wasn't far, it was enough to make him reconsider. He scrambled to his feet and ran back toward the house, shouting at his accomplices inside. Within moments, all four of them bolted toward the backyard and disappeared into the night. My heart was pounding as the police arrived less than 3 minutes later. I was shaking so badly as I climbed down from the treehouse that I thought I might fall. When I tried to explain what happened, my words came out in a jumble. I told them I didn't see a getaway car and hadn't gotten a good look at the intruders' faces. My parents returned not long after, full of concern. I was relieved by their sympathy and support. The police said it looked like the burglars had planned this in advance, knowing my parents would be out that evening. But they hadn't accounted for me being there. Even now, I'm shaken by what could have happened if that man had made it all the way up to the treehouse. I'm back at school now, but I haven't slept well since. The thought of those people returning terrifies me, and I worry constantly about my parents being home alone. I hope this is the end of it, but if something else happens, I'll let you know, though I pray it doesn't come to that. This memory has been weighing on my mind a lot recently. My youngest son, Luke, just left for college, and while I'm incredibly proud of him, the house feels quieter than it's ever been. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. It's funny how, when your kids are young, you dream about having peace and quiet, but when it finally arrives, it's not nearly as comforting as you thought it would be. I'm not sure why, but his departure unlocked a part of my memory I had all but forgotten until now. People often tell my wife and me that it's normal to reminisce about your kids' childhoods during times like this, so I suppose it's not too surprising. I still remember when Luke was just a little boy, full of energy and curiosity, always getting into something. But there's one memory from that time that's definitely not all sunshine and rainbows. Luke was 8 years old when this happened, and even now, I struggle to make sense of it. I'm a carpenter by trade, so I've always been good with my hands. Back then, I was much more energetic, always taking on makeshift projects. One of my proudest creations was the treehouse I built for Luke in the backyard. It wasn't just a simple platform nailed to a tree. I poured my heart into it. It had walls, a roof, and proper wooden stairs leading up to the entrance. It was built to last, and I wanted it to feel like an extension of our house. My wife, Christy, wasn't thrilled about it at first. She thought it was too high off the ground and might be dangerous. But Luke was the kind of kid who would climb trees regardless, so I figured it was safer to give him proper stairs rather than risk him falling off a branch. Christy eventually came around, and Luke absolutely adored the treehouse. To help set the scene, I should explain a bit about our property. Our house sat at the very end of a dead-end street, surrounded by woods. The backyard bordered the forest, which was one of the reasons Christy and I fell in love with the place. It was private and peaceful, perfect for our family. Friends and relatives often joked about how hard it was to find our house. Though the yard wasn't huge, I had chosen to build the treehouse in a spot visible from our bedroom window so I could keep an eye on it. While I couldn't see inside the structure because of the walls, I had a clear view of the stairs leading up to it. For quite a while, everything seemed normal. Luke spent what I'd consider a healthy amount of time playing in the treehouse. His older brother had outgrown that phase, so Luke mostly played up there alone. At some point, Luke started mentioning an imaginary friend named Jake. Since no one in the neighborhood had a child by that name, we knew Jake was imaginary. It didn't seem too unusual. Lots of kids have imaginary friends, but Luke was 8, an age when you'd expect that phase to have passed. Christy thought it was sweet and harmless, but I found it a bit odd since Luke had never been the type to create imaginary friends before. Things started to feel a bit strange when we noticed Luke spending more and more time in the treehouse. Oddly, he wasn't bringing any toys with him. As far as I could tell, he only had his imagination for company. I had made it clear that he wasn't allowed to carry anything heavy up the stairs alone, but it still struck me as odd. One day, my curiosity got the better of me, and I asked Luke about Jake. He acted unusually shy and told me Jake didn't like being talked about. When I asked why he spent so much time in the treehouse, he said Jake only liked to play there and wouldn't come inside. I didn't know how to respond. Weren't imaginary friends supposed to be available anywhere? Later, I did some research and found out that some kids only play with their imaginary friends in certain places, so I decided not to push the issue further. Christy, however, was uneasy. She thought Luke was taking the imaginary friend thing too far, and honestly, I agreed. But we weren't the type of parents to hover. As long as the kids were doing well in school and keeping up with their chores, we let them use their free time however they liked. On most weekends, Luke would play with the neighborhood kids until sunset. They'd ride bikes, play tag, and do all the usual kid things. Luke wasn't the type to get into trouble or fights, so we were shocked when he came home one Saturday with a black eye. After cleaning him up, I asked what had happened. Luke avoided eye contact and stayed silent. I assured him I wasn't angry and just wanted to know the truth. What he said next made my skin crawl. He claimed he had gotten into a fight with Jake. At first, I thought he was joking, but when I pressed him, he started crying and ran to his room. Christy and I assumed he had fought with one of the neighborhood kids and didn't want to admit it. Christy insisted I take down the treehouse, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It had taken me weeks to build, and the idea of tearing it down felt like admitting defeat. Instead, I decided to talk to Luke and tell him this imaginary friend stuff had to stop. But Luke wouldn't come out of his room for the rest of the day. The next morning, I decided to investigate. When I climbed into the treehouse, I was horrified. Scattered around were dirty, tattered children's socks and sneakers, none of which belonged to Luke or his older brother. There were also food wrappers, utensils, and even a few dirty plates. Most unsettling of all were the pencil drawings covering the walls, animals like foxes, bears, and deer. The one that stuck with me the most was a drawing of a massive spider with an eerie, featureless face. I immediately climbed down and confronted Luke. He told me Jake didn't like to talk unless he was fed, so Luke had been bringing him snacks. He also claimed the shoes and socks belonged to Jake, who was forgetful. That was the last straw. From that moment on, I forbade Luke from entering the treehouse. I was convinced he was lying and wanted to punish him until he admitted the truth. Christy was worried about Luke's mental health, and honestly, I was too. We even considered consulting a professional if things didn't improve. But one evening, I saw something that changed everything. As I looked out the bedroom window, I noticed movement near the treehouse. At first, I was furious, thinking Luke had disobeyed me. But then I realized it wasn't Luke. A frail, sickly-looking boy was climbing down the treehouse steps. He wasn't a neighborhood kid and his clothes were filthy. He moved as though he hadn't eaten in days. I rushed outside, yelling for him to stop, but as soon as I opened the door, he darted into the woods. He was freakishly fast and disappeared into the trees before I could catch him. We called the police, who searched the woods for over an hour but found nothing. None of the neighborhood kids were missing, and no reports of missing children had been filed in the area. The police questioned Luke about the boy, and what he told them was chilling. According to Luke, Jake claimed to be a magic boy who lived in the woods with his friends, whom he referred to as animals: bear, fox, and others. Jake had repeatedly begged Luke to leave his family and join him in the woods. When Luke refused, Jake would become angry and make strange noises. I don't know why Luke never told me any of this earlier. Part of me feels guilty for not protecting him better. After that, we never saw Jake again. Christy, who's always been superstitious, believes Jake wasn't human. I'm not one for those kinds of explanations, but the thought still unsettles me. Whether Jake was some kind of supernatural entity or just a kid from the woods, both possibilities are equally terrifying. When I was younger, I had a very unsettling experience at my childhood home. My family moved into that house when I was around 4 years old, so I don't remember much about the place we lived in before. We stayed in what I call my childhood house from the time I was 4 until I was 14, exactly 10 years. I loved that house, and I have fond memories of growing up there. We moved out of state when I was just starting high school, which was a nightmare in itself, but that's a separate story. In the backyard of my childhood home, there was a treehouse. It was built by the previous owners for their children. The kid-friendly nature of the house and its backyard was actually a big selling point when my parents looked at the house. My older brother and I were both excited about the treehouse. My brother Kyle, who's 2 years older than me, was 6 when we moved in, and we both spent hours in that treehouse over the years. However, as the years passed, I stopped using the treehouse. By the time I was 12, I wasn't playing in it anymore, though I was still a bit of a troublemaker at that age. I got in trouble a lot, often throwing temper tantrums and yelling, and I was grounded quite often. One weekend, my dad grounded me for something related to my behavior and grades at school, and like any angsty preteen, I felt like I hated my parents at that moment. That night, I decided not to sleep in the house. I grabbed a couple of blankets and pillows and went to sleep in the treehouse instead. It wasn't the first time I had done this, and my parents didn't mind. It was my way of rebelling. What they didn't know was that I had my Nintendo DS with me, and even though I wasn't supposed to play video games, I spent hours playing Animal Crossing before finally feeling tired enough to sleep. But I don't think I was asleep for long. I don't even think I'd reached REM sleep. I woke up suddenly to a voice calling my name. Tommy, Tommy. I was still groggy and confused, but I could distinctly hear a deep, grown man's voice saying, Tommy, are you up there? I didn't reply right away. My heart was racing for some reason. Then, I heard the creak of the ladder as someone started climbing up. In the near pitch-black darkness, I saw a head poke through the opening in the floor of the treehouse. I couldn't see their face, but I could make out the shape of their head. The voice said, "Ah, there you are." I replied, "Dad?" But then, everything went silent for what felt like 20 seconds. I just stared at the shadow of the person's head, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dark. But something felt off. I stood up and moved to the window, screaming "Dad!" as loudly as I could. I saw the light in my parents' room flicker on, and then I heard hurried footsteps as someone ran down the ladder. A few moments later, my parents burst outside, and my dad swore that he hadn't been outside playing a prank on me. My parents believed me right away. It wasn't like a typical horror movie where the parents don't take the kids seriously. My uncle was an active cop at the time, so my dad called him for advice. The next day, my uncle made a report about the incident. There wasn't much to go on, though. I didn't know much except that I had heard a deep voice calling my name and saw the outline of someone's head. The police couldn't really do anything with that. After that night, I never spent another night in the treehouse. My dad thought for a while that it could have been one of the neighbors directly across from us, but he never could prove it. For years, whenever I'd see that neighbor outside and he'd say hi to me, I would try to recall the voice from that night, but it was always a blur. To this day, it remains an unsettling mystery that sticks with me. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, my dad landed a high-paying job that required us to move from the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania to Brookmont, Maryland. I say required, though that might not be the most accurate way to describe it. In truth, my parents were ecstatic about the move. It was a decision they made quickly and with little hesitation. Within about a month, we transitioned from a small, worn-down house in a low-income area to a sprawling property in one of Maryland's most affluent suburbs. You might be wondering how I felt about all of this. Back then, I was a pretty introverted kid who mostly kept to myself, so I wasn't leaving behind any lifelong friends. I didn't really have any to begin with. Years later, my parents told me that one of the reasons they were so eager to move was to give me a chance at a fresh start. But that's beside the point. At the time, the move didn't bother me much, and I adjusted fairly easily. To be honest, there wasn't much to adjust to. The new house was enormous, and even my 10-year-old self could sense that we wouldn't be struggling financially anymore. I won't bore you with unnecessary details about the house itself. Instead, I'll focus on what matters. I had 2 older brothers, Sean and Harold, and our favorite part of the new house was the backyard. It featured a sprawling area filled with twisting hedges that made for perfect games of hide-and-seek, tag, or whatever else we could come up with. But the best part, by far, was the treehouse at the far edge of the property. To call it a treehouse feels like an understatement. It was more like a tree castle. This wasn't some flimsy weekend project thrown together by a dad with spare planks. It was massive, spanning 6 or 7 trees with 3 distinct levels and an actual staircase. Not a shaky ladder, an honest-to-goodness staircase. It was clear a professional had built it. For a while, my brothers and I spent hours in that treehouse every day. It was always the highlight of our afternoons. But as time went on, my brothers lost interest. They were older and had reached that insufferable teenage stage where nothing was cool anymore. Eventually, I was the only one still playing up there, which devastated me. I hated being left alone in the treehouse, but no matter how much I begged, my brothers refused to join me again. One day, I climbed up into the treehouse and found a folded piece of paper tucked into a corner. To this day, I still remember the exact words written on it. "Hello. I'm the Marshmallow Man. It's nice to meet you. What's your name?" I was thrilled. I immediately assumed one of my brothers had decided to start a game with me. Hoping to lure them back to the treehouse, I decided to play along. A stack of paper had mysteriously appeared in the treehouse, something that struck me as odd since it hadn't been there before. I grabbed one of the markers we kept up there and wrote back, leaving a note with my name in the same spot I'd found the first one. That night, I thought about asking my brothers which of them was the Marshmallow Man, but I was afraid they'd stop playing if I said anything. So, I kept it to myself. For the next several days, I would rush home from school and head straight to the treehouse. Each time, there would be another note waiting for me. At first, the notes were light-hearted and sounded just like things my brothers would say. I was having the time of my life. But as the days passed, the notes began to take a strange turn. The Marshmallow Man started asking questions that felt oddly personal, ones I didn't fully understand. Things like, "What's your favorite time of day to play outside?" Or "What do you usually eat for breakfast?" There's one question in particular that I'll never forget. "Which window in the house is your bedroom?" Looking back, that question leaves me feeling deeply unsettled. At the time, though, I didn't think too much of it. I still assumed it was one of my brothers and answered every question without hesitation. But the next note changed everything. It asked something along the lines of, "What do your pajamas smell like?" That question made my skin crawl. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I stormed into the house and confronted my brothers, demanding to know which of them was behind the notes. Both of them burst out laughing and denied everything. They swore up and down that they had no idea what I was talking about. They even teased me for still playing make-believe in the treehouse. I was crushed. I started crying and ran out of the room, overwhelmed by a wave of hurt and anger. I was convinced one of them had to be lying, so I decided to catch them in the act. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint tapping at my window. My heart started pounding. I was already terrified of the dark, so the sound sent my fear into overdrive. I stayed frozen under my blankets, too scared to move. Eventually, I forced myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I pulled back the curtains and nearly screamed. Stuck to the outside of my window were dozens of marshmallows. I was furious. This had to be my brothers. I decided I'd catch them red-handed that night. I acted like I hadn't noticed the marshmallows and didn't say a word to either of them all day. That night, I lay in wait. When the tapping started again, I jumped out of bed and threw open the curtains, ready to yell at them. But it wasn't my brothers. Standing on the other side of the glass was a man, his shadowy figure illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight. An old, disgusting man with yellow eyes and rotting teeth. His patchy hair clung to his head in clumps, and he grinned when he saw me looking. I don't think I've ever screamed louder in my life. I thought I was going to die. My parents came running, but by the time they reached my room, the man was gone. What followed was a whirlwind of panic. The police searched the property thoroughly, combing through the yard and the treehouse, but they found nothing. They even checked the nearby woods, but the man had vanished. Our neighbors came outside to see what was happening and were horrified when my parents explained. I told the police and my parents everything I knew, but there wasn't much to tell. The police took the notes as evidence, but I doubt they ever did much with them. The man never returned. After that, my parents forbade me from playing in the treehouse. Not that I wanted to anymore. I moved out of that house years ago, but my parents still live there. Every time I visit, I can't help but take a long look at that treehouse. It's a constant reminder of one of the scariest moments of my life. If these treehouse nightmares gave you the chills, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. What would you have done differently in these eerie situations? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to send this video to a friend who's into treehouses. They might need a reminder to trust their instincts. Stay safe, stay cozy, and thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next video.